This talk is part of the special exhibition that's on at the moment called Breed, the British and Their Dogs. It's a great pleasure to welcome you all here tonight. Pleasure to welcome Professor Carol Mavor from the University of Manchester, Professor of Visual Studies, who's going to introduce our speaker tonight, Jo Longhurst. Just to introduce myself, I'm Julie Marie Strange from the School of Arts, Languages and Cultures at the University of Manchester. I'm 1/3 of the academic team behind the exhibition. The other 2/3 are Neil Pemberton and Mick Warboys, who are from the Centre for the History of Science, Technology and Medicine in Life Sciences at the University of Manchester. We were very fortunate in getting a research grant from the Arts and Humanities Research Council on the dog fancy and the emergence of the fancy dog in the Victorian period. We had this insane idea many years ago now wouldn't it be great to do a museum exhibition? And so it's fantastic for us to see this through to fruition. And we hope that you've seen the exhibition, and if you haven't, we would urge you to do so. You've only got until April to see it. So, Jo has been very much involved in the exhibition. She rescued it from becoming Victorian pastiche, from the clutches of Victorian pastiche. But also, you will notice as you come in that there are some badges. Jo very generously created a set of badges for us. These are being sold to raise money for Pets as Therapy. We suggest a donation of £2, but this is extraordinarily good value for you because you get to own a piece of art by an artist of international calibre. Jo is one of 4 nominees for an international prize, photography prize, the Grange Prize. Now you will also note on the back table when you go to purchase your badges for Pets as Therapy that there are some postcards featuring Jo's work. Jo's web address details on the back of this postcard, and if you enjoy what you see here tonight, and I'm sure you will, please go onto Jo's website and vote for her to win the Grange Prize, which will be marvellous all round. So, Jo's going to talk about what dogs might tell us. We think our exhibition does this in a different way. The exhibition is about what dog breeds might tell us about national identity, Victorian values, class, conspicuous consumption, and all that kind of thing. Now, for an exhibition that is on pedigree, and I should emphasise that as part of the team that produced the exhibition, we are extraordinarily grateful to the Kennel Club for all their generosity in giving us time, advice, and loans. But the team behind this project and the exhibition is very much of a happy mongrel. The team is made up of distinct lineages from life sciences, the arts, museum studies, and art itself. So we hope you'll agree by the end of tonight and by the end of the exhibition that some crossbreeding is a good thing. Thank you very much.
To be here tonight in conjunction with the exhibit and to introduce Jo Longhurst. And I think I will begin with a dog quote. And this is from a book called The Difficulty of Being a Dog by Roger Grenier. And it's translated by the French scholar Alice Kaplan, and I highly recommend it. Here we hear, under to be loved. People with dogs, writes Colette Audrey, and behind the bathtub, have discovered a haven even safer and more private than their mother's bosom. Jo is an established and very successful artist that we are fortunate to have up with us this evening. She currently has an exhibit up in conjunction with the Grange Prize at the Art Gallery of Ontario. But she's had many other important exhibits, including at the Photo Gallery in Cardiff, at the Pavilion in Leeds, and she's included in important collections, and even including the British Museum. She received her PhD by practice from the very prestigious photography program at London's Royal College of Art. And as has already been mentioned, currently Jo is a finalist for the Grange Prize to recognize the best in Canadian and international contemporary photography. The public votes on the winner. You can go to her website, but you could also go to the Manchester Museum's website and vote for her. That's something I did before I came in today, and I encourage all of you to do that because she is the best of the four artists. I voted my absentee ballot for Obama and for Jo, so I'm feeling pretty good about myself right now. But let's talk a little bit more about her work and dogs. Jo Longhurst, and you'll see this, gorgeous and compelling photographs of dogs are a gift that keep me thinking about dogs, and for that I'm very grateful. As the Irish-American painter Patricia Patterson explains, a dog is an essential thing. It is essential to dog lovers like myself, people like me who do not understand how people live without dogs. For the art historian Erwin Panofsky, his standard black poodle named Moses was an essential thing. Worth looking up those photographs of Erwin Panofsky of Moses. For Sigmund Freud, there were essential chows. Interestingly, Freud equated women with dogs. They had less aversion to smell than men, hence were better suited for the nursery. Freud essentialized women through the dog, but that is another story. I can give you all the references to that later if you want. J.M. Barrie, the author of Peter Pan, who was famously a very, very tiny man, used his giant Newfoundland named Porthos as a way to essentially play with other children in Kensington Gardens. That is how he met the real Peter of Peter Pan fame and his brood of brothers. For several years, Jo worked with eminent British whippet breeders, photographing their dogs by bloodline, exploring their quest for the perfect dog, and she'll talk to you about that this evening. Jo is sensitive to the desire for and the exploitation brought about through perfection. Her work is a continuum to the great paintings of horses, sheep, and dogs made by George Stubbs in the 18th century. The whippet, for some reason, seems to generate great works on dogs. Alice Kusnar, a whippet lover, has written a first-class book on dogs that I can recommend to you. The title of Alice Kusnar's book is Melancholia's Dog, Reflections on Her Animal Kinship. As you look at Jo's dogs and think more about their big glassy eyes, you might think about Sigmund Freud's Mourning and Melancholia, written in 1917. In relationship to Freud's famous essay, Kusnar tells us that it is the melancholic subject who falls speechless because of a lost object. Kusnar sees the dog as a way to refuse to give up a lost object. I see this in Jo's work as well, in where we get the whippet as a tender and beautiful object who looks quite melancholic. But it is in that look that we are soothed. Later, Sigmund Freud's grandson, Lucian Freud, would say of his human subjects, I'm interested, really interested in them, these humans, as animals. That does not sound like such a good thing. Differently, the strength of Jo's work is that she's interested in her animals, her dogs, as animals. She does not try to make them human, and for that I applaud her. As Donna Haraway writes in her groundbreaking book, The Companion Species Manifesto, Dogs, People, and Significant Otherness, which she published in 2003, Haraway says, contrary to lots of dangerous and unethical projection in the Western world that makes domestic canine into furry children, dogs are not about oneself. Indeed, that is the beauty of dogs. For Jo, a dog is an essential thing, but she does not essentialize the dog. Indeed, that is the beauty of Jo's work. Thank you very much.
Carol, thank you very much for that introduction. That was wonderful. Tonight what I decided to do is I'm going to talk through the project The Refusal, which is this case history I set around British Whippet breeders and their dogs. But I'm also going to talk a little bit about the background thinking, where I was coming from when I first formulated the project, and also a little bit about the process, as it did involve training my boyfriend and one of my dogs in ringcraft and going to a lot of dog shows. So as this talk is a companion to Breed, the British and their dogs, I wanted to make it personal as well as about my final artworks. So to kick off, I'm going to start with a quote from Charles Darwin, who was very fascinated by British, in fact English, dog breeders. In The Origin of Species, he writes, "What English breeders have actually effected is proved by the enormous price given for animals with a good pedigree. If selection consisted merely in separating some very distinct variety and breeding from it, the principle would be so obvious as to hardly be worth notice. But its importance consists in the great effect produced by the accumulation in one direction during successive generations of differences absolutely inappreciable by an uneducated eye." And then he goes on to say, "Not one man in 1,000 has accuracy of eye and judgment sufficient to become an eminent breeder." So very early on he sets this idea that breeding is something specialist. He acknowledges the importance of the eye to any breeding program, so that the effect of looking, the human eye, a vital element in the recognition of perfection. So there's a dual role as an organ of sight and also as an arbiter of good taste. But what really interested me in this essential quote, which is one of the foundations for the project, was that Darwin also displays an essential ambivalence to the idea of perfectibility through any form of selection, whether it's natural or otherwise. He wrote, "Natural selection will not produce absolute perfection, nor do we always meet, as far as we can judge, with this high standard under nature. The correction for the aberration of light is said, on high authority, not to be perfect even in that most perfect organ, the eye." So for Darwin, difference is really important, and this is something that I pick up and explore throughout my work as I create classic breed photographs and set out to explore this exchange of look between human and dog. So this talk is also framed around photography. Mine's a photographic project. And my initial interest in working with pedigree dogs, those dogs bred specifically by breeders wanting a particular visual look, stemmed from a series of a certain history of 19th century photographic portraiture. This particular image you have here is a collection of works by Francis Galton. And these images contributed to the birth, development and popularity of the eugenics movement. So Galton was a 19th century English gentleman scientist of the kind we don't really have anymore. And he was independently wealthy and he explored ideas. He was a cousin of Charles Darwin, so already he was in those circles where they would sit around talking about ideas. He was also a pioneering photographer, and he was very keen to experiment with visual technologies, particularly those that might be able to explore his interest in perfecting the human race. So initially when these works that you can see up here are composite images made with a camera that could take multiple images onto one plate. And initially he started out looking at family and racial likenesses. He was intrigued by the similarities he could see in photographs, and he claimed that his special photographs captured captured photographically the essence of various types of people. He was a very prolific man. I mean, he invented all sorts of things other than photographic inventions. He invented the fingerprint. But looking at this kind of particular way of photographing, he was also prolific, and his research included studies of the criminal, the insane, and those prone to disease. We know him very well now because his theory of eugenics led to unforeseen social change and culminated in the human experimentation in the Nazi camps. The French police anthropologist Alphonse Bertillon was another photographer working around the same time. He also worked in the social sphere, but with very different aims. His photographs were taken with the explicit intent of recording visual detail and identifying individuals. So his was a photographic archive to identify criminals, and he hoped for a systemised control so that he could impose order over disorder. So these are all the different features which in Galton's photographs vanish more often than not because of the composite imagery. Here, Bertillon is very particularly interested in ears and eyes and noses, things that are hard to disguise. And then finally, Dr. Charcot at the Salpêtrière Hospital in Paris, who was a big influence on Freud as he formulated his early theories on dream analysis. Freud actually went along and watched a lot of these experiments. So Charcot also relied heavily on photographic portraiture, and he demanded that the female inmates posed for portraits to further his research into hysteria. And these were highly constructed performances and photographs where the inmates often cooperated to ensure their better treatment in the asylum. I mean, it's interesting, Carol, what you said about Freud and women, because inevitably the women, it was always women that he worked with in these kind of images of hysteria. So in turn, I worked with pedigree dogs, a very specific group, and the ritual performance expected of them in the show ring. I made classic breed photographs to explore the exchange of look between human and dog. I'm going to show you those images, but before I do, I want to talk a little bit about the process. So my first exposure to whippet breeders was at the Queen's Stud in Newmarket, where I went to find my 2 whippet puppies. And in fact, these are my dogs with their litter brothers. And it fascinated me because at the time, I was just interested in getting a pet. But I was also kind of on the lookout for some project idea that I might be able to work with that would engage me long term. And it struck me immediately that dog breeding was fertile territory for a long-term project. It's a highly controlled hobby involving very overt eugenic pedigree breeding programs. But then again, my first experience of the dogs themselves was quite the opposite. So these dogs, all litter brothers, are very happy to subvert their breeders' intentions. So before I could embark on my project, obviously I decided I wanted to work with the best breeders in Britain and ask them to bring their best dogs to me. I got a place at the Royal College. It then struck me that I didn't actually know any whippet breeders other than the 2 I bought my dogs from. So a year of dog shows ensued where I trained my boyfriend and one of my dogs, the one that had 2 testicles and therefore wouldn't be disqualified, in the art of ringcraft. And we set out around Britain to a whole series of dog shows to learn who was who, to identify who the best breeders were, and to try and work out how to engage with them and invite them to be part of the project. These images I'm showing you now are part of a very small 3D book I made. Those are the glasses tucked in the back, which documented this process. And this process was also how I actually engaged with the breeders. So initially I thought just by participating I would become an insider. People would talk to me and I would be able to invite them to join my project. But very soon it became apparent that Vincent was a very skinny whippet. I mean, I knew he was thin, but it turned out he was painfully thin and had a roached back. And none of the really good breeders really wanted to talk to us because I was with the skinny dog. So I had to kind of take a sidestep. So instead I took my very old stereo camera to the dog shows, and I started making photographs of the best breeders and their dogs. I did it quite subtly, and I used to turn up at dog shows with little 3D plastic viewers with the slides in and show them to the breeders that I did know, who would then call over the breeders whose dogs were in the photographs. So this photograph here, I'm not showing you the 3D photographs because you need special glasses for those, but these are slides from one half of a 3D photograph. This is the South Yorkshire Whippet Club Championship show, a hotbed of eminent breeders, writers and judges. And it became apparent to me that the audience to dog shows is a central part of it, is at the heart of the social experience. So in this shot we have some key people who eventually became part of my project. It also, going around the dog shows, became very apparent to me that the Whippet is a dog that is at home in all parts of British society. This is something that had really appealed to me from the outset, because I don't know if it's particular to Britain, but certainly we do tend to associate different breeds of dogs with different types of people. I think that's fair to make that kind of judgment. But a Whippet is really comfortable. This is Major Bailey and Fergal from Bristol. There were ladies and lords who had their Whippets, who have race days on their estates. And then a very eminent Crufts Whippet judge who lives in a council house outside Luton, who also invited me to work with her kennel of blue dogs. So, I mean, it was a wonderful experience. Really, the only thing that matters in Whippet circles is how good your dog is. So, I came across a lot of evidence of devotion. There's a very close bond between the Whippet breeders and their dogs. Despite the very strict rules that they all adhere to. This is Crufts, which we're all very familiar with, I'm sure. Dogs and owners running around the ring, very ritual performance. Possibly the most glamorous of the British dog shows. My experience was far more mundane. This is Vince's first ever show at Barking Canine Club. We had to stop ourselves laughing. It was in a horse, I don't know the term for it. It was a place where they train horses. I'm allergic to horses, so I had to kind of back off with my eyes streaming. You can see in the background Brendan and Vince, Brendan in his Oxfam dog suit, taking it very seriously. And it's the same format at each show, whether it's a glamorous show or a workaday. Every Saturday and Sunday, somewhere in a sports centre or a horse ring in England, there will be a dog show going on. This particular one, entirely Whippets, all morning, all afternoon. So the dog walks around the ring and then is stood on the table to be inspected by the judge. Which leads me on to my first piece of work. So this piece of work is called 12 Dogs, 12 Bitches. It's the establishing work of the Refusal Project, and I found that everything else became a response to or against this work, which features the best dogs from the best breeders in England, presented almost as the show world demands. I found out halfway through the process of shooting these dogs, and I mean taking photographs of these dogs obviously, that I was actually standing the dogs facing the wrong way, so that the side that was being presented to my camera wasn't the side that the judge would actually see. And some of the breeders were quite distressed by that. You know, it actually made a big difference to them. I was secretly quite pleased that somehow as an artist I'd subverted the very strict rules, despite this being my starting point in trying to explore the world of dog breeding by replicating in the most perfect way I could this very formal portrait. This is how breed is pictured, certainly in the animal world and more particularly in the dog world. You look at these animals from the side on. I found this is actually a series of individual photographs. They're each 24 by 16 inches, mounted on aluminium, and then yes, there we have an installation, and then individually hung in a grid on the wall. And it can be installed in various different ways, and it has been. But it's very interesting to me that whereas the Kennel Club has a description of the perfect whippet, it's the Kennel Club standard, and yet these very eminent whippets that have been brought to me show a huge variety of colour and body form. So it was quite fascinating by presenting them in this very kind of rigorous, simple grid with very classic lighting to see how that highlighted the variety and difference within this very tight select group. When I show these, I list, you can probably see just at the back, I list their pedigree names on the wall. And the pedigree names are almost like a symphony in themselves. There's a huge variety. So we've got Champion Carberry Single Malt at Dunbritton, Champion Never Death A for A's. We've got Elephine Blue Blood, Elephine Sapphire Blue, Sholingham Swallows, Sholingham Solo Star. So you see all the lines of the different dogs being repeated throughout the names. A show dog is always viewed side on. It's as if there's only one way to look at the perfect dog. And it occurred to me that the position of photographer and the judge at the dog show have much in common. The whippet was also a great subject for an artist. I like the way the bodies are very visible, pared down. There's nothing hidden under fluffy fur, and you see the basic construction of the body. But also the palette of coat colours is amazing. There is variety and difference in there. They're also, as it turns out, pliable subjects. I was very interested in making the work in issues of control. One of the reasons I was looking at the dogs was to see how that reflected on us and how we organise ourselves, how we are formed today and how we fit in with our own social structures. And when I made these images of dogs standing in the correct posture, you can't actually see on this projector, but I photographed the dogs with a very fine fishing twine round their neck, mainly to stand in for the sense of the collar, the very small leather dog lead that they would wear in a dog show. And when the dogs are standing on a table with this little lead being pulled, it's almost like a trigger. They know that they're in show mode, so they stand like that. And so I had this fishing twine around their neck, so it wasn't pulling them, but it was just, they could feel it, and it was like we're in dog show mode. And their breeders, it was actually attached to a metal rod. Their breeders were standing on a little table to the side. They were standing on a table, and they were all beautifully compliant. But the fishing twine sometimes catches the light in the photographs, and I deliberately left them in. It would have been very easy to remove it, but it's part of this work that, although from a distance the images are very beautiful, they're also quite cold and clinical, and I was feeling there was something missing from my experience of working with those dogs, and I wanted that fishing twine left in as a little reminder of the human control and this kind of controlling relationship between human and dog. As I said before, it's a flexible format but always hung in a precise grid. This was actually my Viva show at the Royal College. And in the middle of the dogs, there's my own dog Terence, slipped in with all the champions. He's not standing right. At the time I thought he just looked beautiful, but even I, when I made the works and included him, realised that he wasn't standing right. More to do with me as an inexperienced in standing a dog correctly for a show. His legs aren't quite right, but magnificent all the same. And the first showing of the work, I invited all the breeders to bring the dogs that I'd selected for this final work, and we made a whippet cam for Terence for the private view. So here he's sitting on my mum's sofa. This was 2003, so before the days you could pop down the pet shop and buy a cat cam or something like that. So I lovingly stitched batteries in a backpack, He had a little bullet camera on his head, and I was most interested in the dog's point of view. Whippets have excellent vision, they're sight hounds, but a very different attitude to looking to humans. And I thought it might be interesting to see what might happen. So the Whippets were all there. Unfortunately, I don't have any photographs of them all there because I was too busy dealing with the breeders. But needless to say, they upstaged the work completely. These amazing dogs, flashes of different colours, rushing around in front of the work. So different to the ideal, perfect presentation depicted in the photographs on the wall. So the real dogs were barely recognisable from their kind of photographic studies. Here, this was a little dog crate near the exit to the gallery, which was actually in a park, so very appropriate. And sure enough, the dogs had their own experience. They would sniff bums, walk around, but surreally, Terence also did walk around and look at all the art. It was a group show, which really got me thinking, because I had assumed until that point that dogs really weren't so interested in image. There were some videos, so maybe it was the movement of the trees or maybe the sound, I don't know, but I have quite a nice recording of that particular group show made by Terence. So this is another work which developed this more clinical strand to the final works. This is called, the previous one I don't know if I said was called 12 Dogs, 12 Bitches. So I was playing on ideas of gender and naming. This piece is called Breed, so very appropriate for today. And in this work, these are individual photographs mounted on aluminium discs and then mounted individually on the wall. And I'll show you some installation photographs in a minute. What I wanted to do with this piece was take this kind of clinical position a little bit further. I'd been thinking very much when I started the project about contemporary human genetic technologies, all the different choices we now can possibly make if we want to, and the potential of the human fertilisation programme. And I was thinking about genomics and its relation to eugenics, and eugenics was obviously completely discredited. And yet somehow there seems to be something going on where other choices and decisions are being made, maybe more personal decisions, but are actually being made. But it's not really so overtly discussed, which is one of the reasons I wanted to work with these pedigree breeding programs, but everything's very overtly discussed. So in this work, I looked at the imperfect aspects of the dogs, trying to allude to the clinical aspects of breeding and the possible failure of method. Mutations, aberrations, and also playing on the visual distortions created by camera and lens. So I'm just going to show you the individual photographs. It's always hard to see things on a PowerPoint presentation, and I always want to stress that the real photographs and artefacts are very different to a PowerPoint. So even though they're photographic, please come and see them at some point, because they're never the same as looking at them on screen. So this work, I worked with one of the best kennels in the south of England, a blue kennel, which means grey dogs to people that aren't dog breeders. And most of these dogs were champion dogs, so very eminent dogs, but really looked through my lens from a different perspective. The breeders were very generous and allowed me to do this. And I photographed them in a way where their limbs were foreshortened. It was maybe difficult to make out the body forms. I was particularly interested in not looking for mongrel or mutant dogs to make this work. The idea of perfection and aesthetics is always so subjective, and I wanted to highlight, our own individual imperfections. So I exposed the blemishes. I photographed them focusing purely on one visual plane, which was their closed eye. So in each image, almost everything is out of focus apart from the fur around the closed eye. A very cold clinical approach, hoping that this circular framing might evoke the microscope or the petri dish, or really just the lens of a camera. I mean, photographs are almost always square, but we don't see things square, and cameras don't see things square. It's just the convention of how photographs tend to be cropped. But I also wanted an emotive content. So although these are very cold clinical images, the way I hang them, I hope that the viewers will identify emotionally with the creatures that are being treated like specimens. Maybe a recognition that these are sentient creatures like us. So the hanging and production of my works is always really important. I want a direct experience with my viewers. I make physical objects and hope for some kind of emotional response to them. These are just some various different ways that they've been shown in exhibition. This was actually to the dogs exhibition in Vancouver a few years ago now, where they were in a dark room with some video and some Martin Parr dog images, and they spotlit them, which was quite interesting. And this was at the New Contemporaries at Rochelle School in London. This particular piece of work is actually on at Canada House in London until January, as part of the London Tiny exhibition related to the Grange Prize. So if you'd like to see it, please go along. I've just included a couple of other pieces which are starting points and haven't been evolved into works, but the working title for this work was Descent / Coloured Bloodlines. And as a work in progress, I was looking at the fur and fur colours recorded from top show whippets, tracing generations of different whippets whose character and natures are partly inscribed through their genes in their coat colours and markings. And I wanted to work with both the very contemporary barcode technology, where all dogs now tend to be microchipped and scannable, but also the visual idea of the family tree, the traditional method of representing lineage. My nieces here might recognise some family Christmas wrapping paper from this, but I'm hoping to make this into some more sculptural work at some point. There was also a sound piece to work with this, with an irregular heartbeat from one of my dogs, alluding to kind of some of the congenital inherited illnesses that pedigree dogs might suffer. So on to a piece I did actually make. This is called At Home. I forgot to talk about the size of the last work, but this is similar. Each of these discs, separate discs, are 40 inches wide, so they're maybe like this. So they're large and these are quite sumptuous. So unlike the black ones, the very clinical, this has a very warm, almost decadent feel. And in these works, I wanted to explore the more intimate relationship between the dog and the breeder. So very rich palette, emotive lighting, very shallow focus again. And I was really responding to some of the reading I'd been doing, despite all my best intentions of not actually reading anything about dogs, but just working with dogs and thinking about humans. I started reading some dog theory, and I was actually quite horrified at what I found. It was before Donna Harrow wrote the fabulous Companion Species Manifesto, which was actually a watershed. When it happened, I wrote to Donna and we got in touch because I just thought, oh, thank God I'm not on my own. But there was still it was almost unthinkable that you could make art about dogs with sentimental emotion. That would be bad art. It would be kitsch or anthropomorphic or sentimental, or it would merely kind of symbolise or represent something human. And all of those things were things I didn't want to do. I'm really glad you picked that up in your introduction, because for me, a dog is a dog, and I love my dogs, but I don't want to make them human, but I want to somehow show that bond that I saw with all the breeders, had this very close relationship with their dogs. So these are my dogs at home. An accompanying piece, a diptych, It's All in My Mind. Like all the circular works, the dog's asleep. Here, Terence is actually dreaming. His legs were going as I photographed him, chasing a sheep or something. And I wanted this very shallow focus again and the circular crop to draw the viewer into the image. But this this closed eye, kind of almost signifying the limit of what we can know about an animal. This is their natural habitat. They're not out there in the forest or in the wild like wolves. Dogs are domestic animals. So I wanted to show that. but I also wanted to recognise they are still animals. So particularly in this image, the canine teeth is for me the significant marker of that. And whereas Descartes defined the animal as a biological machine with no feeling, for me it was interesting that for Freud, dreams are the key to the human psyche. So here we have Terence dreaming. This is an installation photograph, so I hang them slightly offset. The top one is my other dog, Vince. And just to give you an idea of human scale, this is them installed at the Museum Volkwang in Germany. So, many contemporary philosophers and theorists still refuse to take the individual pet seriously. So when considering the image of the dog in art, the dog is represented almost invariably to stand in for humans or to symbolise something other than itself. And in my works, I attempt to challenge this precedent by simply photographing a dog as a dog. And this is the only series of images in the refusal that features a human figure. And it was actually quite difficult for me. I wanted to attempt to give equal status to both man and dog as cultured domestic creatures. I actually started out using myself as the subject, but strangely the art historical weight of the human female figure just made that impossible. It was there was something going on that wasn't what I was trying to do, so I instead substituted a male figure, and it became more interesting for me. I'm also interested in the human-animal instinct, so I think this one I particularly liked. There was something, the dogs, it was late in the evening, my subject had been out and was tired and kept falling asleep, not great to work with, but actually not so bad. The dogs also were kind of making themselves comfortable, and I really liked the fact that they were really just being, and I tried to capture that on this kind of stark leather sofa. And this kind of idea of human-animal instinct is something I've developed in my new work with gymnasts. So those last three images I showed you are all untitled portraits. The final one of the series, which I was showed you slightly offset from the first three, I actually gave a title. It's called Portrait of a Dog. And it plays on the similarity and difference between us. I wanted to question this received distinction between us. I felt that maybe the pet could be seen to parallel historical representations of women. Like women, it's traditionally been constructed as something which is looked at. So here it's the man's body that's subjected to the camera's gaze. It's a camera operated by me, a woman. And the dog, which is usually looked at, confronts the viewer directly. So it looks back. I didn't intend to make this image. The dogs were meant to be asleep, but my dogs actually love having their photographs taken. They behave far better when there's a camera around, but they also pose. And Vincent actually sat up and dropped his paw and just stared at the camera, and I felt, gosh, he's giving me an image here. And I just loved the way it mirrored the human hand. So this was a little gift. I think this is the closest I got. I think maybe it's impossible to photograph a dog as a dog, but this is called A Portrait of a Dog. And this one's called Double Portrait. And again, I wanted to look at the shared experience and the recognition, how we grow up together and how important and similar we can be to each other. So this series of portraits, probably my best known, is called I Know What You're Thinking. They're large portraits. Each individual portrait is 40 by 30 inches, so the width is about this wide, and they're tall. And when I hang them in a gallery, I hang them so that when you come in, when you walk in, the eyes are about at human eye height. So you're met by this very steady animal gaze. And for me it was a question, I was trying to pose a question, what does it mean to be looked at by a dog? And how is that different to an exchange of looks between humans? And here we have Freud with his beloved dog Yoffie. Freud really loved his dogs, and he talked about them in his the diary of his final 10 years. He writes about them quite a lot, and it's fairly interesting. He writes with possibly more empathy than he does about his grandson, who dies young. It's quite fascinating. But I included this portrait because of the way that he's looking at his dog and the way his dog is looking back. And animals obviously don't talk, so there's always an added emphasis placed on the gaze. And I wanted to explore this idea of a mutual exchange, not just projecting human concerns onto a dog. So when looking at a photo of a dog, I may identify with it instantly without necessarily knowing why. I think a dog portrait is somehow more pared down than a similar human portrait. For me, it has a direct impact. A human portrait, however stripped down in style and expression, such as the portraits of Thomas Ruff, famous German photographer who photographs humans, still gives me an idea of the sitter's identity as I look for clues in dress, hairstyle or makeup. The image is silent, but the viewer can more easily give the subject an imaginary voice. A dog portrait is altogether different. When I look at an image of a dog, I feel an inexplicable connection. Now, a show whippet is bred to be looked at, but it's impossible to know what the dog is actually thinking or feeling. I can't know what's going on in the creature's head, but instead maybe I'm forced to consider what it's like to be human. The dog's always taken every detail of physical and emotional presence. Anyone who has a dog knows that. They always know how you're feeling. They also spot those little details which mean that you're going out and leaving them rather than just going around the corner or going into another room. But a dog has no concept of perception, of perfection or aesthetics, and that's interesting to me. So I think there's a certain freedom when a dog looks at you, a freedom that's not possible in an exchange of looks between humans. This image here is an installation called Sighthound, which plays with the physical effect of looking and being looked at. It's an installation of 3D viewers, the same viewers I used to snare my whippet breeders in the first place, but set into a wall in the gallery with stereo slides lit behind them. And I haven't got images of the actual content, but they are dogs hunting. Their quarry is always elusive, so you can see the backs of dogs or the tails or them running or the grass. So they're out in the field hunting, but you never quite see what it is that they're after. And it's the same for the viewer. So that gives you an idea of the 3D stereo slides, if you don't know them, give you a very different vision. You have to let your eyes relax and look around the slide, and you can see minute details. So every little blade of grass in the forest that they're running through becomes alive. And I hang the work slightly lower than is comfortable for human vision. So the work has to be experienced physically. The viewer has to crouch slightly lower than they might do, mimicking the body pose of the whippet, and also mimicking the process of looking. And then a series of images where I more overtly played with the idea of a dog's vision and how that might be different to ours. They've got a very different attitude to image than we do. That really interests me as an image maker. So I sat a series of dogs in front of a mirror and found that although I've heard now that other breeds are different, a whippet has no interest in looking at itself. So more often than not, the moment they realised it wasn't another dog, they would twist or turn away. So that image you just saw is part of this work, which is, again, they're 40 by 40 images, so it's a large panel installation. I form these mirrored dogs into a pack, an instinctual animal grouping, but one that's culturally determined through the layers of mirroring. So there's the real dogs in the mirror, and I focused again on the dog's eye, but sometimes the dog's eye would be in the mirror, and sometimes it would be the actual dog, depending on how the dog reacted. So as you walk along, there's a kind of pushing and pulling of the focus plane, which is a little disorientating. I also mirror a couple of the images, which you may be able to spot. So there's an artistic mirroring going on as well. And then a diptych, finally. This kind of lack of interest in their own images, this lack of narcissism, it seems to be a kind of big difference to me between human and animal. And the dogs often refuse to behave how we expect them to. So to give you an idea of scale, that's the last image installed alongside Breed. This is a study called The Decisive Moment. It's called Study for Showroom, which is a 4-screen immersive video installation, restaging a dog show from the judge's perspective. It's still not made. But in this work I return to the objectifying gaze of the judge. And actually I was at a dog show in a village hall, low light at the end of the day, videoing the interrelationship of human and animal bodies in the postgraduate pitch class of a Whippet Club show. So they wait for their turn in the spotlight. And it's a kind of play on the celebrated concept of photographic perfection, Cartier-Bresson's very famous ideas. And the work kind of slowly undoes it. It's a very slow, painful 4 minutes, 26 seconds. And the dog endlessly adopts the perfect show pose with a little help from its owner. It's quite painful, but at the same time, occasionally you just see the owner's hand stroking the top line of the dog off camera, but you see in the reflection is going, and the dog kind of breathing. And then finally, at the back there, this is the refusal, part 1. This is the one of the last works to be made in the project, but actually one of the first to be photographed. So I shot this image in 2001. It was one of the Yorkshire Whippet photography sessions. I went around the country and set up studios. And this little dog, this little white dog, Lily, really stuck in my mind. She was immaculate and I got some great photographs. But then she very precisely and particularly, I'll show you the image close up, with the fishing twine still around her neck, defiantly steps out of line. So she refuses to hold that pose, refuses to do what's being asked of her. And I love this idea that this very small gesture, little act of resistance, established her as a dog that was stuck in my mind. And the refusal became the title of the body of work and the show and the book. And although it can be a negative word, it has a very defiant positive aspect. After I'd named the show, I came across a quote from Michel Foucault, who, although I'm not a big reader of philosophy, I always seem to happen across very pertinent things written by Michel Foucault. Maybe because he's so interested in discipline in the body and social structures. But the quote I found I used as a title, a subtitle within the book. Maybe the target nowadays is not to discover what we are, but to refuse what we are. So I'm going to finish with this slide, which is the badges. which these are objects drawn from objects borrowed from various collections for the breed show. On the left we have bulldog cufflinks and tie-pin from the British Museum, and in fact on the right is a gold painted brooch with a crystal dome, which is in the, you can see these objects in the show. They look quite different to badges. Also from the British Museum. The metal dog collar is an ancient collar from the Museum of London. The canine skull is from the Hunterian Museum. The coin below is an Irish wolfhound coin. And finally, last but not least, those little funny objects you can barely make out are Pekingese dogs dressed up as babies. It's a Victorian print we discovered, Neil and I discovered at the Kennel Club. So fabulously barking and bonkers, we had to put it in. So these are for sale around the corner, and all the proceeds go to the Pets as Therapy Read to Dogs campaign, where children who aren't confident with reading are encouraged to read to a dog rather than a human being. And it's a very effective campaign. It's a very small charity, so please dig in your pockets. Thank you.